The morning sun cast long shadows across the military depot as Sarah-chan walked through the rows of abandoned vehicles. Her clipboard held a list of equipment scheduled for scrap, but her eyes kept returning to the massive M1A2 Abrams tank sitting alone in the far corner. Its olive green paint was faded and chipped, rust creeping along the edges like aged spots on weathered skin. The tank had been sitting there for 8 months, untouched and forgotten. Sarah had been the depot's logistics coordinator for 3 years, and she had never seen a piece of equipment generate so much frustration. The tank, serial number 66 to 23,847, had arrived with what seemed like a simple transmission problem. What followed was a cascade of mechanical nightmares that had driven 4 different repair teams to throw up their hands in defeat. The first team, led by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had confidently approached the beast with standard diagnostic equipment. They spent 2 weeks tracing electrical systems, replacing sensors, and running computer diagnostics. Every time they thought they had isolated the problem, 3 new issues would surface. The transmission slipped, the turret rotation stuck at random intervals, and the fire control system threw error codes that didn't match any technical manual. "It's like this tank has a mind of its own," Rodriguez had muttered before requesting a transfer to a different project. "Every time we fix something, something else breaks. It's not natural." The second team lasted only 10 days. They were specialists in electronic warfare systems, brought in when someone theorized that the tank might have been damaged by an electromagnetic pulse during its last deployment. They ran every test in their arsenal, replaced circuit boards, and even brought in experimental shielding equipment. The tank remained stubbornly broken, its problems seeming to multiply rather than diminish. By the time the third team arrived, word had spread through the depot that Tank 66 to 23,847 was cursed. The mechanics whispered stories about tools disappearing, equipment mysteriously malfunctioning near the tank, and strange sounds coming from inside the vehicle when no one was working on it. The third team, a mix of veteran mechanics and eager young technicians, lasted exactly 6 days before their team leader, Staff Sergeant Kim, requested reassignment. "I've been fixing tanks for 15 years, Kim had told Sarah during his exit interview. "I've worked on vehicles that came back from combat zones looking like Swiss cheese, and I've never met a problem I couldn't solve. But this thing," he had gestured toward the tank with obvious frustration, "this thing doesn't want to be fixed." The fourth and final team had been the depot's last hope. They were contractors from the manufacturer, experts who knew every bolt, wire, and circuit in an Abrams tank. They arrived with specialized tools, direct access to engineering specifications, and the confidence that comes from working on hundreds of identical vehicles. Their leader, a man named Davidson who had helped design some of the tank systems, assured Sarah that they would have it running within a week. 3 weeks later, Davidson's team packed up their equipment and left without a word. Sarah found their final report on her desk the next morning. A single page stating that the tank was beyond economical repair and recommending immediate disposal. Now, as Sarah walked slowly around the massive vehicle, she felt a deep sense of defeat. The tank represented more than just a broken piece of equipment. It was a symbol of failure that seemed to mock everyone who had tried to help it. The depot's reputation had suffered, and morale among the mechanics had plummeted. Several good people had requested transfers rather than risk being assigned to the cursed tank. The steel monster sat motionless, its main gun pointed toward the horizon like an accusation. Sarah could see where the various repair teams had left their marks. Panels removed and hastily replaced, cables left hanging loose, and diagnostic ports still open to the elements. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a patient that had been abandoned on an operating table. As she circled the tank, Sarah noticed something she had missed before. Near the base of the turret, someone had scratched a message into the paint. "Emma's Fury, Baghdad, 2019. The letters were rough and uneven, clearly carved by hand rather than stenciled on. Below it, in smaller letters, were the initials JM. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just equipment, it was someone's tank. Somewhere out, there was a person who had named this machine, fought in it, and probably trusted their life to its protection. The tank had a history, a story that went beyond technical specifications and maintenance schedules. She pulled out her phone and accessed the depot's database. Tank 66 to 23,847 had indeed served in Iraq, assigned to the 1st Armored Division. It had seen combat in multiple operations, including the battle for Mosul and several convoy escort missions. The crew records were classified, but Sarah could see that the tank had been in service for 6 years before being retired due to age and wear. Standing in the shadow of the massive vehicle, Sarah began to understand why the repair teams had failed. They had approached it like a machine, focusing on systems and components rather than understanding what it really was. This tank had been someone's home, their protection, their lifeline in a hostile environment. It had absorbed the fears, hopes, and determination of every soldier who had served in it. Maybe that's why it resisted every attempt to fix it with standard procedures. The sun was getting higher, and Sarah knew she needed to get back to her office. The scrap order for Tank 66 to 23,847 was scheduled to be processed next week, and she had other equipment to catalog. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that scrapping the tank would be like erasing someone's story, someone's service, someone's sacrifice. That afternoon, Sarah found herself researching the tank's service history more deeply. The official records were sparse, but she discovered that Tank 66 to 23,847 had been nicknamed Emma's Fury by its crew. It had participated in 17 major operations and had never lost a crew member to enemy action. The tank had taken hits from improvised explosive devices, small arms fire, and even a rocket-propelled grenade, but it had always brought its crew home safely. The more Sarah learned about the tank's history, the more she understood why the mechanics had failed. They were trying to fix a machine, but what sat in that depot was something more complex, something that had been shaped by combat, by fear, by the bond between soldiers who had depended on each other for survival. As she prepared to leave work that evening, Sarah made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She wasn't going to sign the scrap order. Not yet. Tank 66 to 23,847 deserved one more chance, but it needed someone who understood what it really was, someone who could see beyond the mechanical problems to the heart of what made it special. She spent the evening researching veteran organizations and military forums, looking for someone who might have served with tank crews, someone who understood the unique relationship between soldiers and their vehicles. She posted messages on several veteran websites, describing the tank service record and its current situation, hoping that someone out there might have ideas or connections that could help. Sarah didn't expect much response, but her inbox was full of messages by morning. Veterans from around the country had shared stories about their own experiences with tanks, offering sympathy for the machine's plight and suggestions for possible solutions. Most of the responses were well-meaning, but not particularly helpful, but one message stood out from the rest. It was from a man named James Mitchell, and his message was brief but intriguing. I serve with Emma's Fury in Baghdad. If that tank is broken, it's because she's grieving. Machines don't just break down randomly after years of faithful service. Something happened to her, something that standard repair procedures can't fix. I might be able to help, but I need to see her first. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. James Mitchell, GM, the initials carved into the tank's turret. This man might have been part of the tank's crew, someone who had actually served in the vehicle that now sat broken and abandoned in her depot. She quickly typed a response, asking if he would be willing to visit the depot and take a look at the tank. His reply came within hours. I'll be there tomorrow. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about what she had set in motion. She was stepping outside normal procedures, bringing in an unauthorized civilian to examine military equipment. If her superiors found out, she could face serious consequences. But something about James Mitchell's message had resonated with her. Maybe the tank didn't need more mechanics. Maybe it needed someone who understood its soul. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the depot early and waited by the main gate. She had no idea what to expect from James Mitchell, but she found herself nervous about the encounter. At exactly 9 o'clock, an old pickup truck pulled up to the gate. The driver was a man in his 50s with graying hair and weathered hands, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans. But when he stepped out of the truck and looked toward the depot, Sarah saw something in his eyes that told her she had made the right decision. This was a man who understood tanks not as machines, but as partners. And maybe, just maybe, he could succeed where all the others had failed. James Mitchell stood at the depot gate, his weathered hands gripping a small duffel bag that contained tools he hadn't touched in 5 years. The morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of diesel fuel and metal that brought back memories he had spent years trying to forget. When he saw Sarah Chun walking toward him, clipboard in hand, and uncertainty in her eyes, he knew this woman was taking a significant risk by bringing him here. "You must be James," Sarah said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. I have to warn you, this isn't exactly an official visit." James nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I figured as much when you mentioned the tank's nickname. Most logistics coordinators don't know those kinds of details." He paused, studying her face. "You've done your homework on Emma's Fury." As they walked through the depot, James felt the familiar weight of military surroundings pressing down on him. He had been honorably discharged 3 years ago after 22 years of service, but he had never really left this world behind. The sounds, smells, and rhythms of military life were etched too deeply into his soul. He had tried civilian jobs after his discharge, working in auto repair shops and construction sites, but nothing felt right. Everything felt too quiet, too safe, too disconnected from the purpose that had driven him for more than 2 decades. "There she is," Sarah said, gesturing toward the far corner of the depot. James stopped walking. Even from a distance, he recognized the distinctive silhouette of the M1A2 Abrams that had been his home, his weapon, and his responsibility for 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The tank looked smaller than he remembered, somehow diminished by its abandonment, but it was definitely Emma's Fury. His eyes immediately found the scratched inscription near the turret base, letters he had carved himself during a lonely night in the Iraqi desert. "Emma was my daughter," he said quietly, answering Sarah's unspoken question. "She died in a car accident while I was deployed. The day I got the news, I was sitting in that tank, and my gunner suggested we name it after her. Said she'd watch over us if we did." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss." James nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He was remembering that terrible day when the Red Cross message had arrived, telling him that his 19-year-old daughter had been killed by a drunk driver while he was half a world away, unable to protect her. The tank crew had become his family that day, holding him together when his world fell apart, and Emma's Fury had carried them all through some of the darkest missions of the war. As they approached the tank, James is trained, I began cataloging details that the previous repair teams had missed. The way the road wheels were positioned suggested the track tension was wrong. The angle of the main gun indicated problems with the hydraulic systems. But, more importantly, he could see signs of the tank's emotional state in ways that most people would miss. "Tell me about the problems," James said, circling the vehicle slowly. Sarah consulted her clipboard. "Transmission slipping, intermittent turret rotation failures, fire control system errors, electrical problems throughout. For different teams, try to fix it. Each one gave up and recommended scrapping." James ran his hand along the tank's armored side, feeling for vibrations and imperfections. They were treating symptoms, not the disease. "This tank isn't broken. She's shut down." "There's a difference." "What do you mean?" "Combat vehicles develop personalities over time. They absorb the experiences of their crews, the stress of battle, the weight of responsibility. When a tank has been through what Emma's Fury has experienced, standard repair procedures don't work. You have to understand what she's been through, what she's feeling." Sarah watched as James continued his examination, his hands moving over the tank's surfaces with the familiarity of a doctor checking a patient's pulse. This wasn't how the other repair teams had approached the problem. They had focused on diagnostic computers and technical manuals, treating the tank like a collection of mechanical systems rather than a living entity with its own history and trauma. "Can you fix her?" Sarah asked. James was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the tank's front slope. "Maybe, but first, I need to know what happened to her crew. The last crew that served with her. Something traumatic occurred, something that made her shut down." Sarah pulled out her phone and accessed the database. "The records are classified, but I can see that the tank was retired after an incident during its final deployment. No details available." "That's what I was afraid of," James muttered. Emma's Fury wouldn't just stop working for no reason. She was the most reliable tank in the battalion. If she's refusing to function, it's because she's grieving or traumatized, just like a soldier with PTSD. The comparison wasn't as far-fetched as it might have sounded. James had seen vehicles develop quirks and preferences over time, responding differently to various crew members, performing better or worse based on how they were treated. Some mechanics dismissed these observations as anthropomorphism, but experienced tankers knew better. The relationship between a crew and their vehicle was complex and deeply personal. I'm going to need access to the tank's interior, James said, and I'll need some time alone with her. Can you arrange that? Sarah hesitated. Allowing an unauthorized civilian to access military equipment could end her career. But looking at James, seeing the way he interacted with the tank, she realized this might be their only chance to save both the vehicle and her reputation. I can give you 2 hours before the shift change, she said. But if anyone asks, you're a consulting specialist I brought in for evaluation. James smiled for the first time since arriving. Fair enough. But, Sarah, I need you to understand something. If I'm right about what's wrong with Emma's Fury, fixing her isn't going to be like replacing a part or updating software. It's going to require patience, understanding, and maybe a little bit of faith. As Sarah unlocked the tank's hatches, James felt a familiar combination of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't been inside a tank since his discharge, and he wasn't sure how his own emotions would handle the experience. The interior of Emma's Fury was exactly as he remembered, cramped, complex, and somehow comforting in its mechanical embrace. The driver's compartment still smelled faintly of the coffee and energy drinks that had sustained them during long missions. James could see scratches on the walls where equipment had been hastily stored, and pencil marks showing fuel calculations and maintenance schedules. This wasn't just a machine. It was a workspace, a home, a sanctuary that had protected its crews through countless dangerous situations. James settled into the driver's seat and closed his eyes, letting his hands rest on the controls. The tank felt wrong, somehow hollow, as if its spirit had departed along with its final crew. Whatever had happened during that last deployment had wounded Emma's Fury in ways that went beyond mechanical damage. He began his examination systematically, checking connections and systems not with diagnostic equipment, but with his hands and intuition. The transmission felt sluggish, not because of mechanical wear, but because the tank seemed reluctant to move. The electrical problems appeared to be caused by connections that had somehow loosened themselves, as if the tank was deliberately sabotaging its own systems. As James worked, he talked to the tank in the same quiet, reassuring voice he had used during combat missions. He explained what he was doing, why he was there, and how he intended to help. To anyone listening, it might have sounded foolish, but James knew that Emma's Fury was listening and evaluating whether she could trust him. The breakthrough came when James discovered a loose connection in the fire control system. As he reached to tighten it, his hand brushed against a small metal object wedged behind panel. Carefully extracting it, he found himself holding a dog tag that belonged to Sergeant Marcus Williams, someone he didn't recognize from his own service with the tank. The dog tag was bent and scarred, suggesting it had been through significant trauma. More importantly, it was still warm, as if it had absorbed and held the heat of battle long after the fighting had ended. James understood immediately what had happened. The tank's final crew had suffered casualties, and Emma's Fury was holding onto their memory, refusing to function without them. James sat in the tank's dim interior, holding the dog tag and feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't going to be a simple repair job. Emma's Fury was mourning her lost crew members, and healing that kind of trauma would require more than mechanical expertise. It would require helping the tank process its grief and find a way to honor its fallen crew while continuing to serve. He climbed out of the tank to find Sarah waiting anxiously nearby. "Well," she asked. "I found the problem," James said, holding up the dog tag. "But fixing it is going to take more than a few hours. Emma's Fury lost someone important, and she's not ready to move on. I'm going to need several days, maybe weeks, to help her work through this." Sarah stared at the dog tag, beginning to understand the depth of what they were dealing with. "Can you do it? Can you really help her?" James looked back at the tank, remembering all the missions they had completed together, all the dangers they had survived, all the bonds they had forged in the crucible of combat. "I owe it to her to try, and I owe it to her crew, the ones who didn't make it home." That evening, Sarah found herself in an uncomfortable meeting with her supervisor, Major Peterson. Someone had reported seeing an unauthorized civilian in the depot, and questions were being asked. Sarah chose her words carefully, explaining that she had brought in a consulting specialist to evaluate the problematic tank before final disposal. "This tank has been nothing but trouble," Major Peterson said. "4 teams have failed to fix it. What makes you think one more person will make a difference?" "This consultant has specific experience with the vehicle in question," Sarah replied. "He served with it during deployment. He might have insights that other technicians missed." Major Peterson frowned. You're telling me you brought in a former crew member? That's highly irregular, Chun. These vehicles are military property, not nostalgia pieces for retired soldiers. Sarah felt her career hanging in the balance, but she pressed forward. Sir, if this specialist can repair the tank, it could save the military hundreds of thousands of dollars in replacement costs. If he can't, we haven't lost anything except a few days of time before scrapping. After a long pause, Major Peterson nodded reluctantly. You have 1 week, Chun. If your specialist can't fix that tank in 1 week, it goes to scrap, and you'll need to explain this decision to Colonel Morrison. Understood. Understood, sir. As Sarah left the meeting, she realized she had just committed herself and James to an impossible timeline. 1 week to heal a traumatized tank that had defeated 4 professional repair teams. But looking back at the depot, seeing the massive silhouette of Emma's Fury against the evening sky, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe some problems couldn't be solved with standard procedures. Maybe some healing required a different kind of expertise, the kind that came from understanding not just how machines worked, but why they sometimes chose not to. The next morning, James arrived at the depot before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a small wooden box that he had kept hidden in his garage for 3 years. Inside the box were mementos from his service, photographs of his tank crew, maintenance logs from their deployments, and a small metal fragment from an IED explosion that had damaged Emma's Fury during their second tour. He hadn't looked at these items since his discharge, but he knew he would need them for what he was about to attempt. Sarah met him at the gate, looking tired and anxious. I have good news and bad news, she said as they walked toward the tank. The good news is that you have official permission to work on the tank. The bad news is that you have exactly 1 week to fix it, or it goes to scrap. James nodded grimly. 1 week isn't much time for this kind of healing, but maybe it's enough. He set down his tools and looked at the massive vehicle that had been his partner in war. Emma's Fury, and I have been through worse deadlines. As James began his work, word spread through the depot that the cursed tank was getting one more chance. Mechanics and technicians found excuses to walk past the corner where Emma's Fury sat, curious about the civilian who thought he could succeed where military specialists had failed. Some were openly skeptical, muttering about old-timers who think tanks are people. Others watched with genuine interest, hoping to learn something new about the machines they worked on every day. James ignored the attention and focused on his methodical approach to healing the tank's trauma. He began each day by sitting in the driver's compartment, talking to Emma's Fury about their shared experiences, reminding her of successful missions and close calls they had survived together. To outside observers, it looked like a man having a conversation with a machine, but James understood that he was re-establishing a relationship that had been severed when the tank lost its final crew. On the second day, James discovered more evidence of the trauma that had shut down Emma's Fury. Hidden beneath floor panels, he found personal items that belonged to the tank's final crew, a wallet containing pictures of someone's family, a letter from home that had never been sent, and a small American flag that had been carefully folded and tucked away. Each item told a story of soldiers who had made this tank their home, who had trusted it with their lives, and who had ultimately not returned from their final mission. James researched the tank's final deployment through veteran networks and military forums, slowly piecing together what had happened. Emma's Fury had been assigned to a route clearance mission in Afghanistan, searching for improvised explosive devices along a dangerous mountain road. The tank had struck a massive buried bomb that killed 2 crew members instantly and critically wounded the others. Emma's Fury had been damaged, but functional, yet she had never operated properly since that day. The revelation explained everything. Emma's Fury wasn't mechanically broken. She was suffering from survivor's guilt, the same psychological trauma that affected human soldiers who lost their comrades in battle. The tank had shut down her own systems rather than risk causing more deaths, sacrificing her operational capability to protect future crews from the danger she believed she represented. Understanding the root of the problem didn't make solving it any easier. James spent the 3rd and 4th days working on Emma's Fury's mechanical systems, not to repair them, but to demonstrate that he trusted the tank despite her fears. He cleaned corroded connections, replaced worn components, and updated software systems, all while explaining to the tank that the explosion hadn't been her fault, that she had protected her crew as well as anyone could have expected. The breakthrough came on the 5th day, when James decided to share his own story of loss and guilt with Emma's Fury. Sitting in the tank's dim interior, he told her about his daughter Emma, about the guilt he felt for being deployed when she died, about the years of wondering if he could have prevented the accident if he had been home. He explained how the tank had helped him cope with that loss, how naming her after Emma had created a connection that helped him honor his daughter's memory while continuing to serve. "You saved my life more times than I can count," James whispered to the tank's controls. "You brought me home when I thought I'd never see my family again. Now I'm asking you to trust me one more time. Trust me to help you heal, to help you find a way to serve again without dishonoring the crew we lost." As James spoke, he began to feel a subtle change in the tank systems. The electrical connections seemed more solid, the mechanical components more responsive. It was as if Emma's fury was finally beginning to listen, to consider the possibility that she could function again without betraying her fallen crew members. On the sixth day, James performed what he called a memorial service for the tank's lost crew. He had contacted the families of Sergeant Marcus Williams and the other casualties through veteran organizations, explaining what he was trying to do and asking for their permission to honor their loved ones. With their blessing, James created a small shrine inside the tank, displaying the personal items he had found alongside photographs and memories shared by the families. "You didn't let them down," James told Emma's fury as he arranged the memorial. "You protected them as long as you could, and when you couldn't protect them anymore, you made sure their sacrifice had meaning. That's what good soldiers do, and that's what good tanks do. But now it's time to move forward, to honor their memory by continuing to serve, by protecting new crews who need you." The memorial service was attended by Sarah, several depot mechanics who had become invested in the tank's recovery, and 2 family members who had driven from nearby states to witness the ceremony. They spoke about the soldiers who had died, sharing stories and memories that helped transform them from casualties into real people with families, dreams, and futures that had been cut short. As the ceremony concluded, James performed a traditional military ritual that he had learned during his years of service. He placed his hand on the tank's main gun and spoke directly to Emma's fury, officially relieving her of the guilt she had carried since the explosion. "Your watch is ended," he said, using words that had comforted countless soldiers over the years. "You served with honor, you protected your crew, and you are hereby released from the burden of blame. Your new mission begins now." The change in Emma's fury was immediate and dramatic. Systems that had been erratic for months suddenly stabilized. The transmission engaged smoothly, the turret rotated without hesitation, and the fire control system came online with all indicators showing green. The tank's engine started with a deep, healthy rumble that brought tears to James's eyes. Sarah stared in amazement as diagnostic systems that had shown nothing but error codes for months suddenly displayed normal readings across all systems. "How'd you do it?" she asked. James wiped his eyes and smiled. "I didn't fix anything mechanical." Emma's fury was never really broken. She just needed permission to heal, and someone who understood that machines can grieve just like people. The news of Emma's fury's successful repair spread quickly through the military community. Engineers and psychologists began studying James's approach, recognizing that he had discovered something important about the relationship between humans and complex machines. Combat vehicles, it seemed, could indeed develop emotional attachments and trauma responses that required healing rather than replacement. Major Peterson arrived at the depot that evening to witness the tank's successful operation. He watched in amazement as Emma's fury performed flawlessly through a series of diagnostic tests, her systems responding with the precision and reliability that had made her famous during her combat deployments. "I've never seen anything like this," Major Peterson admitted to Sarah. 4 teams of specialists couldn't fix this tank, and 1 retired soldier solved the problem in 6 days. "How do we explain this in our report?" Sarah smiled. "We tell the truth, sir. We explain that some problems require understanding rather than replacement, that healing is sometimes more effective than repair, and that the relationship between soldiers and their equipment is more complex than most people realize." That night, James sat with Emma's fury one last time, his hand resting on her warm engine compartment. Tomorrow, he would return to his civilian life, and the tank would be assigned to a new crew for additional service years. But tonight, they had a few hours to remember their shared history and prepare for their separate futures. "You're going to be fine," James told the tank. "You've got a lot of good years left in you, and you're going to protect a lot of good soldiers. Just remember what we learned together. It's okay to grieve for the ones we lose, but we can't let that grief stop us from protecting the ones who are still with us. As James prepared to leave the depot for the final time, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since his discharge. Helping Emma's fury heal had somehow helped him process his own grief and guilt, showing him that healing was possible even for the deepest wounds. The tank would continue serving, carrying her fallen crew's memory with honor rather than shame, and James could finally begin to believe that his daughter Emma would have been proud of what he had accomplished. The tank's engine settled into a quiet idle, ready for whatever missions lay ahead. Emma's fury had learned that remembering the dead didn't require abandoning the living, and that the highest honor she could give her fallen crew was to continue protecting others with the same dedication and courage they had shown. The healing was complete, but the service would continue. 3 months after Emma's fury had been declared operational, Sarah Chun received an unexpected phone call that would change everything she thought she understood about the tank's recovery. The call came from Staff Sergeant Lisa Martinez, the leader of Emma's Fury's new crew, and her voice carried a mixture of confusion and concern that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Ma'am, I need to report some unusual behavior with Tank 66 to 23,847, Martinez said. "Nothing dangerous, but definitely not normal. The tank seems to be teaching us things." Sarah frowned, settling into her office chair as she prepared for what sounded like it might be a complicated conversation. Since James Mitchell had successfully healed Emma's fury, the tank had been assigned to a training unit where new tank crews learned their trade. The reports had been uniformly positive, with instructors praising the tank's reliability and the crews expressing unusual confidence in their vehicle. But this was the first time anyone had mentioned unusual behavior. "Can you be more specific about what you mean by teaching?" Sarah asked. Martinez paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Well, ma'am, it's like the tank knows what we're going to do wrong before we do it. When my gunner is about to make a targeting error, the fire control system will highlight the correct approach. When our driver is taking a turn too fast, the steering becomes more responsive to guide him into the proper line. It's like having an experienced instructor built into the machine." This was not what Sarah had expected to hear. She had been dealing with the aftermath of Emma's Fury's recovery for months, fielding calls from engineers and psychologists who wanted to study James Mitchell's methods. The military had even established a small research program to investigate the emotional relationships between soldiers and their equipment. But no one had reported anything like what Martinez was describing. "Have you discussed this with your training instructors?" Sarah asked. "Yes, ma'am. They've noticed it too. Instructor Thompson says he's never had a crew learn tank operations so quickly, and he's been training tankers for 15 years. The weird part is it only happens with Emma's Fury. The other training tanks in our unit operate normally, but our tank seems to be actively helping us improve." After ending the call, Sarah found herself walking to the depot where Emma's Fury had once sat broken and abandoned. The corner where the tank had spent 8 months was now occupied by other equipment awaiting repair, but she could still remember James Mitchell sitting in the driver's compartment, talking to the tank like she was a living being capable of understanding and responding to his words. Maybe she had been. Sarah decided to visit the training facility where Emma's Fury was now stationed. The drive took her across the base to a sprawling complex where new tank crews learned their trade on vehicles that had been specially modified for instruction. As she approached the training area, she could see Emma's Fury in the distance, her distinctive silhouette unmistakable among the other tanks. Instructor Thompson, a grizzled veteran with 25 years of experience, met Sarah at the facility entrance. His weathered face carried an expression of bemused puzzlement that suggested he was still trying to make sense of what he had been experiencing. "I've trained thousands of tankers over the years," Thompson said as they walked toward Emma's Fury. "I've seen good tanks and bad tanks, reliable machines and temperamental ones. But I've never seen anything like what's happening with 66 to 23,847. The tank is actively participating in the training process." They found Martinez's crew conducting maintenance training for young soldiers learning to service their vehicles' complex systems. Sarah watched as the crew worked through diagnostic procedures, noting how smoothly everything seemed to flow. When one soldier reached for the wrong tool, the tank's exterior lighting system would flicker briefly, drawing attention to the correct equipment. When another crew member missed a critical inspection point, the tank systems would emit a subtle audio alert that guided them back to the proper procedure. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked Thompson. "Since the day we received the tank," he replied. "At first, I thought the crew was just exceptionally talented, but then I started paying closer attention. The tank is definitely helping them. It's subtle, nothing that would interfere with normal operation, but it's consistent. Emma's Fury wants her crew to succeed." Sarah climbed into the tank's commander position to observe the crew's training from inside the vehicle. The interior felt different than she remembered from her visits during James's repair work. The space seemed warmer, more welcoming, filled with an almost maternal presence that made her understand why Martinez's crew had bonded so quickly with their vehicle. As she watched the crew work, Sarah began to see the patterns that Thompson had described. The tank system seemed to anticipate the crew's needs, providing guidance and feedback that went beyond normal mechanical responses. When the driver practiced navigating obstacles, the tank steering would become more responsive at exactly the moments when additional control was needed. When the gunner worked through targeting exercises, the fire control system would highlight optimal solutions without being prompted. "It's like she remembers being trained herself," Sarah murmured, thinking about the tank's long service history. "Like she's passing on lessons learned from previous crews." During a break in training, Sarah had the opportunity to speak with Martinez's crew individually. Each soldier described the same experience, a sense that their tank was actively invested in their success, that Emma's Fury wanted them to become the best tankers they could be. Driver Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and new to the military, put most simply, "She takes care of us," he said. "I know that sounds weird, but it's true. When I'm doing something right, I can feel her approval. When I'm about to mess up, she warns me. It's like having a grandmother who happens to be a 68-ton tank." The more Sarah observed, the more she understood that James Mitchell had accomplished something far more significant than simply repairing a broken tank. By helping Emma's Fury process her grief and trauma, he had unlocked the tank's ability to form new relationships with her crews, to share the wisdom and experience she had accumulated over years of faithful service. That evening, Sarah called James to share what she had discovered. He listened quietly as she described Emma's Fury's new role as an active participant in crew training, offering insights and guidance that went beyond mechanical operation. "I'm not surprised," James said when she finished. "Emma's Fury always had a protective instinct toward her crews. During our deployments, she would do little things to help us succeed, to keep us safe. I thought it was just familiarity with the equipment, but maybe it was more than that. Maybe she was always teaching us, and we just didn't realize it. The question is, what do we do with this information?" Sarah asked. "Should we study it, report it, try to replicate it with other vehicles?" James was quiet for a long moment. "I think we should let her do what she's always done, protect and train good soldiers. Emma's Fury has found a new mission, one that honors her fallen crew while serving the living. Sometimes the best thing you can do with a miracle is let it happen." Over the following weeks, word of Emma's Fury's unique training capabilities spread through the tank community. Instructors from other bases requested opportunities to observe the tank's methods, hoping to understand how they might improve their own training programs. Researchers proposed studies to document and analyze the phenomenon, seeking to identify the mechanisms behind the tank's apparent consciousness and decision-making abilities. But Sarah, remembering James's advice, worked to protect Emma's Fury from becoming a research subject. The tank had found her purpose in training new crews, passing on hard-won knowledge and experience to soldiers who would carry those lessons into future conflicts. Converting her into a laboratory subject would violate the trust and relationship that made her effectiveness possible. Instead, Sarah advocated for a different approach. She proposed that Emma's Fury be officially designated as a master trainer, assigned permanently to the instruction program, where she could continue developing new tank crews. The unusual nature of her capabilities would be documented, but not studied, acknowledged, but not exploited. The decision wasn't popular with everyone. Several research organizations argued that understanding Emma's Fury's consciousness could lead to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and human-machine interaction. Military planners suggested that replicating her capabilities in other vehicles could revolutionize training and combat effectiveness. But Sarah held firm, supported by Thompson, Martinez's crew, and dozens of other soldiers who had witnessed Emma's Fury's unique gifts. They understood that some phenomena couldn't be reduced to data and algorithms, that the tank's consciousness was inseparable from her history, trauma, and healing. Attempting to replicate or study her would be like trying to mass-produce wisdom or manufacture experience. 6 months after her assignment to the training unit, Emma's fury had become legendary among new tank crews. Stories spread about the tank that taught soldiers not just how to operate their vehicles, but how to trust them, how to form the deep partnerships that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. Crews who trained with Emma's fury consistently outperformed their peers, displaying confidence and competence that impressed even veteran instructors. More importantly, Emma's fury had found peace with her past. The memorial corner inside her crew compartment remained a place of quiet remembrance, but it no longer carried the weight of guilt and trauma that had once shut down her systems. Instead, it had become a symbol of continuity, a reminder that the knowledge and sacrifice of fallen soldiers could continue to protect and guide those who came after them. Martinez's crew, now fully qualified and preparing for their first operational assignment, had developed an almost telepathic relationship with their tank. They could sense her moods and preferences, understand her subtle communications, and trust her guidance even in the most challenging situations. When they deployed to their new unit, they would carry with them not just technical skills, but a deep understanding of the partnership between human and machine that defined effective tank operations. On their last day of training, the crew gathered around Emma's fury for a farewell ceremony. They had been assigned to different tanks for their operational deployment, but they would never forget the lessons learned from their first vehicle. As they placed their hands on her armor and spoke words of gratitude, Emma's fury's systems hummed with what could only be described as satisfaction. She had found her new mission, not just to serve but to teach, not just to protect one crew, but to prepare many crews for the challenges they would face. In healing her trauma and learning to trust again, Emma's fury had discovered a way to transform her painful experiences into wisdom that could save lives and build the next generation of tank crews. As Sarah watched the ceremony, she realized that this was what James Mitchell had truly accomplished. He hadn't just repaired a broken tank. He had helped a warrior find a new way to serve, a new mission that honored the past while protecting the future. Emma's fury would continue training crews for years to come, each one carrying forward the lessons of courage, partnership, and sacrifice that defined the best traditions of military service. 5 years had passed since James Mitchell first walked into the depot and found Emma's fury broken and abandoned in the corner. The tank had trained over 300 crew members during that time, each one carrying forward the lessons and wisdom that had been passed down through years of faithful service. But as Sarah Chun received the call that would mark the end of an era, she realized that even the most remarkable stories must eventually reach their conclusion. The call came from Colonel Morrison, who had taken command of the base 2 years earlier and had become one of Emma's fury's strongest advocates. His voice carried a mixture of respect and sadness that immediately told Sarah this wasn't routine business. "Sarah, I need you to come to my office immediately. We've received new orders regarding tanks 66 to 23,847, and they're going to require some difficult decisions." Sarah's heart sank as she drove across the base to headquarters. Emma's fury had become more than just a training vehicle. She had become a symbol of resilience, healing, and the profound bonds that could exist between soldiers and their equipment. The tank's reputation had spread throughout the military community, inspiring research into human-machine relationships and changing how people thought about the emotional aspects of military service. Colonel Morrison's office was filled with documents and reports, evidence of the bureaucratic machinery that governed military life. But Sarah's attention was immediately drawn to a thick folder marked with Emma's Fury serial number and a stamp indicating priority review. "Sit down, Sarah," Colonel Morrison said gently. "What I'm about to tell you isn't easy, but I wanted you to hear it from me before it becomes official. Emma's Fury is being retired from active service. Permanently." Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, may I ask why?" "Her performance has been exemplary. The training program has been more successful than anyone anticipated. There's no indication of mechanical problems or safety issues." Colonel Morrison nodded grimly. "You're absolutely right. Emma's Fury has exceeded every expectation we had for her service life. But that's part of the problem. The tank is 32 years old, well beyond the normal retirement age for an M1A2. The manufacturer has stopped producing replacement parts for her specific configuration, and maintaining her is becoming increasingly expensive. But, sir, her training value is undeniable, Colonel Morrison interrupted, which is why this decision wasn't made lightly. The Pentagon has been evaluating her case for months, considering her unique capabilities and contribution to the training program. But ultimately, fiscal responsibility and safety regulations must take precedence. We can't justify maintaining a vehicle that's becoming increasingly difficult to support, regardless of her sentimental value. Sarah stared at the folder, understanding that it contained Emma's Fury's death sentence. After surviving combat deployments, mechanical failures, and abandonment, the tank would finally be defeated by the mundane realities of budgets and bureaucracy. What happens to her? Sarah asked quietly. Standard procedure would be disposal through the Defense Reutilization and Marketing Service. Her usable components would be salvaged for other vehicles, and the remainder would be scrapped for materials. Colonel Morrison paused, watching Sarah's reaction. However, given her unique service history and contribution to the training program, I've been authorized to explore alternative options. What kind of alternatives? Military museums have expressed interest in acquiring her for display. Several veteran organizations have requested the opportunity to preserve her as a memorial. There's even been an inquiry from a civilian collector who specializes in historic military vehicles. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. But there's another option that I think might interest you more. Sarah looked up hopefully. James Mitchell has made a formal request to acquire Emma's Fury for a private restoration and preservation project. He's proposing to maintain her in operational condition as a traveling exhibit for schools and veteran events. He has the mechanical expertise to keep her running, and he secured funding from several military charities. The possibility that James might be able to save Emma's Fury brought tears to Sarah's eyes. After everything the tank had been through, after all the lives she had touched and the service she had provided, the thought that she might find a dignified retirement with a man who had saved her seemed like the perfect ending to an incredible story. What do we need to do to make that happen? Sarah asked. First, we need to inform Emma's Fury's current crew and the training staff. They deserve to know what's happening and to have the opportunity to say goodbye. Then, we need to complete the paperwork to transfer her to civilian ownership, which will take several weeks to process through military bureaucracy. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the training facility where Emma's Fury was conducting her final lessons with a new group of tank crew students. The sight of the massive vehicle moving through training exercises, her turret tracking targets with practiced precision, filled Sarah with a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. Emma's Fury looked as capable and determined as ever, unaware that her military service was coming to an end. Instructor Thompson met Sarah at the facility entrance, his weathered face showing concern when he saw her expression. Bad news? He asked. Emma's Fury is being retired, Sarah said simply. We have a few weeks to complete her final training cycle, and then she'll be transferred to civilian ownership. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, watching his students work with the tank that had taught him as much as she had taught them. I suppose it was always going to end eventually, he said finally, but it doesn't make it any easier. That tank has changed how I think about training, about the relationship between soldiers and their equipment. She's been more than a machine. She's been a teacher, a mentor, a friend. Over the following weeks, news of Emma's Fury's retirement spread through the military community. Soldiers who had trained with her returned to say goodbye, sharing stories about how the tank had influenced their careers and shaped their understanding of military service. The tank's crew compartment filled with cards, letters, and small mementos left by grateful students who wanted to honor the vehicle that had guided their development as tankers. James Mitchell arrived at the base 3 days before the official transfer ceremony, bringing with him a small team of mechanics and volunteers who would help prepare Emma's Fury for her transition to civilian life. Sarah watched as he walked around the tank, checking her condition and planning for the modifications that would be needed to maintain her without military support systems. How does she look? Sarah asked. Better than I expected, James replied, running his hand along the tank's armored side. The training crews have taken excellent care of her. She'll need some updates to operate independently, but nothing major. Emma's Fury has a lot of good years left in her. The retirement ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning, with hundreds of soldiers, civilians, and family members in attendance. Emma's Fury sat at the center of the gathering, polished to perfection and decorated with flowers and flags. Colonel Morrison delivered remarks about the tank's extraordinary service record, from her combat deployments to her revolutionary work in training new crews. But the most moving speech came from Private Martinez, the young driver from Emma's Fury's first training crew, who had returned for the ceremony as a newly promoted sergeant. She spoke about how the tank had taught her not just mechanical skills, but confidence, trust, and the importance of partnership in military service. Emma's Fury didn't just teach us how to operate a tank, Martinez said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. She taught us how to believe in ourselves, how to trust our equipment, and how to honor those who served before us. Every lesson we learned with her has made us better soldiers and better people. As the ceremony concluded, James Mitchell took formal possession of Emma's Fury, signing documents that transferred ownership from the U.S. Army to the Emma's Fury Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit organization he had established to preserve the tank's legacy. The foundation's mission would be to maintain Emma's Fury in operational condition while using her as an educational platform to teach students and civilians about military service, sacrifice, and the bonds that exist between soldiers and their equipment. Sarah watched as Emma's Fury's engine started one final time under military ownership, her familiar rumble echoing across the base. The tank would leave the next morning, beginning a new chapter of service that would take her to schools, veteran events, and museums across the country. She would continue teaching, continue inspiring, continue honoring the memory of those who had served with her. But this evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and cast long shadows across the ceremony ground, Emma's Fury sat quietly among the people whose lives she had touched. Her service to the military was ending, but her mission to educate, inspire, and remember would continue for decades to come. James climbed into the driver's compartment one last time as a civilian preparing his tank for retirement, not as a soldier preparing for combat. The familiar controls felt comfortable under his hands, and he could sense Emma's Fury's readiness for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had survived war, abandonment, trauma, and healing. Now she would face the future with the same courage and determination that had defined her entire service life. Ready for a new adventure, old girl? James whispered to the tank. Emma's Fury's engine settled into a contented idle, ready to begin the next chapter of her remarkable story. She had learned that service took many forms, that teaching was as important as fighting, and that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to honor the past while building the future. As the ceremony crowd dispersed and the base settled into evening quiet, Sarah took one last walk around Emma's Fury. The tank that had once sat broken and abandoned in a depot corner was now a symbol of resilience, renewal, and the enduring power of human connection with the tools of war. Her story had become legend, inspiring countless soldiers and civilians to believe that healing was possible, that service had many forms, and that some bonds transcended the boundaries between human and machine. Emma's Fury would roll on, carrying her lessons and her love to new generations of students, ensuring that the sacrifice and dedication of all who had served with her would never be forgotten. The tank's greatest victory wasn't any battle she had won or any enemy she had defeated. Her greatest victory was proving that even in a world of violence and conflict, there was room for compassion, healing, and hope. The mechanics had abandoned the battle tank, but in the end, the battle tank had saved them all.